part of the reinvention movement, or as Mark put it in a better way, the rethinking movement in government all across the country. Last year you had the guru of reinvention as the speaker. For those of you who were here last year, David Osborne, whose book sparked a lot of the excitement that we are now part of. So I feel like I've got a heavy responsibility following in David's footsteps. This is a very propitious timing because the Gore productivity review report is just out, and Mark nicely stated the relationship between the Gore Commission and the Winter Commission. The Winter Commission, chaired by Governor William Winter, who was governor of Mississippi, and who has been actively involved and a leading spokesman for the work of that commission. As Mark said, and I want to say this right at the outset, if you want to change government, you can't just work in Washington. The very first chapter of the Winter Commission report, very first paragraph, says there are 15 million state and local government employees, and that doesn't count the people in nonprofit groups that have increasingly, so importantly, become the extensions of government for the provision of social services. State and local employees alone are 13% of the national labor force. So I fully agree, you won't be surprised to hear me say this with Mark, that the Winter Commission agenda is one that we need to talk to you about, and I hope you will pick up on. Mark mentioned in his introduction that I was once a former budget official, and I think that will haunt me and embed in my character all my life, and it always brings me to want to tell a story that helps me organize my remarks and get us started this morning. There was a former budget official, and what happened to this former budget official is what happens to all of us. He dies. And what happens to this former budget official is what I fear in my bones happens to all former budget officials. He is relegated to Satan's domain for his eternal just deserts. And he has an interview with the devil, and the devil says, "Mr. Former budget official, you have three choices, and make your choices wisely, because these are choices forever and ever." Only speaking to a budget official, he probably said three options. And the first one, he said, "I'm going to show you," and he takes him into a big room, and everybody is standing on their heads on a hard marble floor, huge room. And then the devil says, "Number one." Number two, he takes him into a huge room, just as big, and everybody is standing there on their heads, only the floor is carpeted, a little more comfortable. That's number two. And the devil says, "Now I'll take you to number three." And number three, everybody is standing up, and they're drinking coffee, and they're knee-deep in mud and muck. It looks unpleasant, but they're standing and they're drinking coffee. The devil says, "Now make your choice." And the former budget official says, "I choose this third chamber, where everybody's standing up knee-deep in mud and muck, drinking coffee." And the devil says, "Are you sure?" And the former budget official says, "Yes, I am sure." The devil closes the door and leaves, and somebody in the back says, "Okay, coffee break's over, back on your heads." Now, I like to use that story for government audiences for two reasons. One is that the moral of that story is to beware of unanticipated reactions. Always be thinking about what might happen, and don't be surprised, and be ingenious in thinking about what might happen. But the other reason that I like to tell that story is it helps me to get us started, and to say that I have three chambers today for my talk. Three parts of what I want to present to you, and they are these. First of all, I want to talk about the Winter Commission, who's on it, who supports it, what it's doing, and what it intends to do not just to have a report, but a follow-up series of important activities to work with critical ideas. Second, I want to tell you a little bit about what's in the report. You have attached to my paper the summary of it, which I'll tell you about in a minute, and we can send you a copy of the report, which we presented to President Clinton at the White House in June at a meeting with the President. And third, I want to talk to you about my notes, what I called notes for a presentation. Some ideas that I have that relate to the Gore Commission and the Winter Commission, personal ideas that I would like to share with you about where we're headed. So first of all, to talk about the first chamber where everybody's standing on their heads. No, that first part of my talk, to talk to you about the Winter Commission. Who's on the commission? How did it get started? What does it do? How it got started comes with a sort of a little story. Before I went to the Rockefeller Institute of Government, which sponsors the Winter Commission, at the State University of New York in Albany, I was a faculty member at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. And one of my colleagues, still there, is Paul Volcker, who chaired the Volcker Commission, which was about the national public service, as Mark said. Paul had an office right below mine, and I have a very loud voice. I like to have a microphone, but I don't even need it. And Paul has an even louder voice, so we could always hear each other when we were excited through this window between our two offices. And I got to know Paul Volcker, and when he was working on the Winter Commission, I went to see him, and I said, Paul, you're missing a step. All the people that do things, the main things that happen in government in America, are done by state and local governments, as I said earlier on. And if yours is a commission on public service, you must look at state and local government. And so Paul, being a reasonable man, said, that's a very interesting idea, Dick. Why don't you come to one of our meetings and talk to everybody about it? So I went to a meeting at Princeton, at the Woodrow Wilson School, of the Volcker Commission, and I made my wonderfully convincing statement of why state and local government and American federalism have got to be part of what you're about if you're about public service. And when I finished this very good statement, they all said to me, well, it's a very good statement, but we're not going to do it. It's too late. We've got all these ideas about the pay and role of federal civil servants, and that is what we want to focus on. So Volcker said to me, Dick, it's a very good idea. They're not going to do it, but why don't you do it? Why don't you have a commission and look at state and local public service? And the idea stayed with me and Frank Thompson, and many of my, Frank is the dean of our School of Public Affairs and executive director of the commission, and many of my friends and associates in Albany and in the field of American state and local government. And sure enough, 2 years ago, with wonderful support from 4 foundations, we formed the Winter Commission. And we reached out to an absolutely marvelous person to be chairman of it. Governor Bill Winter is an exemplary, caring person who has devoted hours of his time working on the report and going around the country talking about it, and set up the meeting we had with President Clinton about the report. And I like the fact that Governor Winter is chairman of the commission, because the commission's based in New York, of course, and you know how people think of New Yorkers. But when you hear Governor Winter talk with his wonderful, soft Mississippi accent, you know this is a national commission. This is not just a bunch of New Yorkers talking. And the commission consists, just to give you some feel for it, of experts in the field, state officials, local officials, a range of people, several of whom, in fact 3 of whom, are now leading officials of the current administration. Just to read some names, Reuben Askew, Mary Jo Bain, who's in the Department of Health and Human Services in charge of welfare, Yvonne Braithwaite-Burke, who was on the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, is still on, Henry Cisneros, John DiUlio, Scott Fossler, the Executive Director of the National Academy of Public Administration,